My neighbor Jessica regularly drops her 7-year-old son at our backyard fence and yells, "Play with Tommy for a few hours." No asking, no planning. She just disappears. Last Saturday, she literally lifted Bryce over our fence while my family was having a barbecue with relatives we hadn't seen in years. "Emergency at work," she shouted before speeding off. Bryce had no shoes on, just socks, and was carrying a bag of stale donuts for lunch. My aunt pulled me aside and whispered, "Who is this child?" Before I could explain, Bryce announced he needed to use our bathroom but couldn't hold it. He proceeded to wet himself on our patio while my elderly grandmother was sitting right there. Instead of being embarrassed, he just shrugged and said, "Mom says accidents happen." When I called Jessica, it went straight to voicemail. Bryce casually mentioned she was probably at her boyfriend Derek's house because that's where she goes for emergencies, then asked if we had any beer because his mom sometimes gives him sips to help him sleep. My husband found Bryce digging through our garbage, looking for aluminum cans. "Mom gives me a quarter for each one I find," he explained, pulling out coffee grounds and food scraps with his bare hands. When we gave him soap to wash up, he said he wasn't allowed to use soap at home because it was too expensive. During dinner, Bryce grabbed food directly off other people's plates with his hands. When my mother-in-law gently corrected him, he replied, "Mom says rich people have weird rules about food," then stuffed dinner rolls into his pockets for later and asked if he could take home some meat for his mom. Around 8 p.m., most guests had left, and Jessica still hadn't returned. Bryce curled up on our couch and said this was normal. Sometimes she came back the next day. He pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper with our address and said, "Mom wrote this down in case I forgot where you live." When Jessica finally showed up at 11 p.m., smelling like a mix of perfume and alcohol and wearing a completely different outfit, she was annoyed that we gave Bryce a bath. "I don't have time to deal with wet hair in the morning," she muttered. Bryce was already asleep, so she scooped him up and walked away. The next morning, I found a note taped to our fence. "Tommy's mom, Bryce will be over after school. Back by dinner. Jay." No phone number, no emergency contact, just an assumption that we'd become her unpaid babysitters. When I confronted her that evening, she laughed and said, "I thought you liked kids. Isn't this what neighbors do for each other?" She then asked if we could start watching Bryce on weekends too because Derek didn't like having kids around. I later discovered she'd been telling other neighbors we were her go-to childcare. Mrs. Chen down the street even thanked us for helping Jessica balance work and parenting. Except Jessica doesn't work. I see her at home during regular hours, just not when Bryce needs supervision. The breaking point came when she knocked on our door at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, clearly just getting home from a night out. "Can Bryce stay here today? I need to sleep off this headache," she said, literally pushing him forward in pajamas. I said no. She looked at me, genuinely confused. "But he's already here," she argued, like being present was permission. Bryce stood there shivering. It was 40 degrees outside, barefoot again. When I insisted she take him home, she actually said, "Fine, but if child services shows up asking why he missed school, I'm giving them your address." I called the school that day and learned Bryce had already missed 23 days this year. The attendance officer said they'd been trying to reach Jessica, but her phone was disconnected. Apparently, Bryce told them his mom moved and forgot to leave a forwarding address. The final straw? I found Bryce asleep in our backyard shed at 7 a.m. Jessica had dropped him off the night before without telling anyone. He'd spent the night outside alone, in the cold, with only a small blanket and a flashlight. When I stormed over to confront her, she opened the door in a bathrobe, sipping coffee, and casually said, "Oh good, you found him. I wasn't sure if you guys were home." Then she had the audacity to ask if we had extra cereal because they were out of kid food again. When I asked what kid food meant, she said, "Anything that isn't Red Bull or leftover pizza." That's when I realized this wasn't just irresponsibility. It was outright neglect, and we'd been covering for it without even meaning to.